Hey, welcome along to another video edition of Mark's Mailbox. You know how it works. We do it live in audio around the planet on our Clubland Q&As. And if at the end of the live edition we got a bunch of questions I didn't get to and they're sufficiently intriguing, then I like to do a video mailbox picking up some of those excellent questions. First one from Chicken Soup. Possibly not his real name or her real name. Chicken Soup writes, I hope to hear your comments about an increasingly troubling issue. The level of inflammatory rhetoric from the left with charges of racism and disparagement of all who are white. It seems to be increasing and inflaming the leftist base in a way that is dangerous in the future and in some cases dangerous now. Your take? Well, I can't disagree with you, Chicken Soup. It's patently racist. And what's interesting to me is that we have moved in terms of the demonization of white people from the demonization of specific people for specific behavior to a generalized slur. Joe Biden, for example, the next president of the United States, apparently, Joe Biden said white people don't get it. He didn't mean this particular white people. He doesn't mean all the white Democrat racists, the white Democrat segregationists that he worked with when he first came to Washington in the 1970s. He means white people in general don't get it. And I don't know why he should think he's the only white person who does get it, so he can tell all the other white people that white people don't get it. But I think this actually does cross a line, this general demonization of a group of people based on their skin color pushes us into dangerous territory. There was an interesting video clip, in fact I think there were 3 of them, on a local Minneapolis television station. Minneapolis is one of those towns people don't think of as a big seething ghetto. The only things most people know about Minneapolis are that Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion started there, and the Mary Tyler Moore Show opening titles are from there. So the culture is a lagging indicator with respect to what's happening in Minneapolis. But these horrifying videos of a gang of black youths beating up some white guy for no particular reason, just because he happens to be a white guy strolling along the sidewalk. And it is difficult to argue that they shouldn't be doing that when you have Democrat candidates explaining that white people are the problem. Not this white person who did that, not those white people in the Democrat Party who did all the Jim Crow stuff for a century. But actually just white people in general, however non-racist they might think they are, or however non-racist they might objectively be. The same people tell us that Trump, by his careless use of code words and dog whistles, is encouraging white supremacists and white nationalists to go postal all over the American map. Yet they see no problem, they see no connection between these appalling videos in Minneapolis, say, and Joe Biden excoriating all white people. Obviously, they're different spots on the same continuum, but what's sauce for the Republican goose has to be sauce for the Democrat gander too. Michael Cavino writes, Hi Mark, I'm curious as to know your thoughts about the Trump administration's recent win in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals with respect to its change to the asylum laws, requiring that anybody seeking asylum in the US must first apply in the first country they come to. The Supreme Court upheld this decision 7-2 a few days ago, so will the Ninth Circus actually follow the rule of law going forward? Has Trump successfully reshaped this circuit? One of the reasons I think Trump won in 2016 was due to the list of federal judges he would consider for Supreme Court vacancies if he were elected. I would hope he follows suit in 2020. I don't think well, to be honest, Michael, let me step back. I don't think it's worth getting that excited about this because the Supreme Court upheld that decision 7-2. So one is curious as to why it wasn't 9-zip, because obviously both as a general proposition and as international law and as a simple matter of basic logic, there is no reason why, if you happen to be in a country that's gone belly up, in Somalia, say, or Yemen, or Libya, or wherever it happens to be, that you should flee that country to take asylum in the glittering citadel of the world superpower halfway around the globe. The whole idea of asylum, well, the Syrian civil war, for example, huge numbers of refugees, many Syrians flee to Jordan. Jordan is as obvious a place as any for those Syrians to stay. They're among similar people in a similar culture. The idea, and it's safe, and you can live your life there without being tortured and killed. The idea that refugee status now means that a guy in Somalia has the right to become a refugee in Sweden or in Vermont is patently ridiculous. So all we're asking here is for judges to recognize the obvious. And the fact that we're impressed because 7 out of 9 on the Supreme Court happen to recognize the obvious, those 7 swallows do not make a summer. And Walt Trimmer references a word I used on the show the other day. Walt Trimmer says, word of the day from Greek, kritarchy, rule by judges, and adds apparently it's racist. It's racist to point out that we are ruled by judges. I made the reference with regard to judges in the United Kingdom adjudicating the prorogation of Parliament, where judges in England and Northern Ireland have said it's legal, but judges in Scotland have said otherwise. So it's now got a the Scots finalists and the English and Irish finalists now all go through to the Grand Championship games, and we'll see who wins. And Kurt Piper adds, dear Mark, I may or may not be a simple country actuary, but your comments are frequently more prescient on important issues than anyone else. Now, Kurt, you're beginning to sound like Obama prostrating himself before the King of Saudi Arabia. Enough of that. It could be the most important observation out of other important observations you made here was that important people are appointed judges. Namely, the elite are appointed to be judges so that rule by judges is explicit rule by the elites. You have previously noted that if our elected representatives are overruled by bureaucrats, i.e. mid-level elites, we are not a republic. Even worse is if we, the people, sue the republic, our cases are heard by the more important elites in robes. The whole business about being ruled by bureaucrats, Kipling, when he was living in Vermont, recognized this early on. What was it he said? I think he said, Americans have thrown over a king only to prostrate themselves before the clerk of the customs house. And he was not impressed by excessive deference to bureaucracy. Now we have a permanent bureaucracy that actively defies the preferred policies of the elected, of the legislators and of the elected president. But rule by judges is always worse. As you say, it takes it to the next level. Judges are necessarily an elite occupation. People have to go to law school. They become lawyers. At some point, they then become judges. It's one of the most elite professions there is, even today. Most of our so-called universities are like these payless shoe source colleges strung out along the highway. Every rinky-dink town you've never heard of has a payless shoe source college. If you drive past one, there'll be another one 200 yards down the road. But the law schools, for the most part, are still relatively elite and serious places, which is why Elizabeth Warren was driven to pretend to be a Cherokee in order to get into Harvard Law School and become Harvard Law School's quote-unquote first woman of color, which is tough to say with a straight face. They are necessarily elite institutions, and therefore rule by judges is necessarily rule by elites. The more decisions you have made by judges, the more there is a massive transfer of power from the people and from representative institutions of the people into the hands of the elite. And I made this observation with reference to the judges, to the elite's attempt to use the courts to subvert Brexit in the UK. One of the disturbing trends, I'm not a great believer in so-called constitutional courts and in judges essentially legislating political questions under the pretense of interpreting a constitution. So, for example, if you're going to have same-sex marriage, I think it's healthier for a parliament to vote for it, as they did in London, or for the people to vote for it in a referendum, as they did in Dublin, rather than, as in Washington, for 5 judges to pretend that the guys in the powdered wigs a couple of centuries earlier had cannily foreseen the need for safe-sex marriage in the Constitution. And one of the disturbing trends of recent years has been that kind of American activist judicialism spreading elsewhere. In Canada, with Monsieur Trudeau's ghastly Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which to a large degree turned Canadian courts into something closer to American courts, and now, as we see in the UK and in other Commonwealth jurisdictions and in Europe. Christine Dewey says, Tommy Robinson has just been released and not much by the media to say about it. At least he's still alive. I would be interested in his experience. For those of you who don't know, Tommy Robinson is someone that British judges like locking up. All kinds of people all over the country do the same things Tommy Robinson does and don't get locked up. But Tommy Robinson has caught the attention of the elites, and they don't like it, in part because he indicts the elites. The Rotherham scandal, whereby thousands of girls, and it's duplicated in other towns all over England, have been taken into sex slavery by so-called grooming gangs, which is a kind of euphemism for Pakistani gangs that do terrible things to these girls. I've spoken before. I've met a lot of these girls in Rotherham, and I find their stories very moving, but also horrifying. You know, they're doused in gasoline, and then these guys dance around them with lit matches, threatening to light them up. But that's not the point. The point is that all the institutions of state power, whether it's the social services, whether it's the police, whether it's the politicians, especially in that stinking crap hole of Rotherham, do nothing about it. And Tommy Robinson, whatever you feel about it, is on this issue. And the judges don't like him being on this issue. And they keep finding reasons to throw him in jail, something to do with his mortgage application, I think it was originally. And then in jail he gets beaten up because they always manage conveniently to put him in a cell next to some Islamic tormentors. And it's interesting. Again, it's the choices. It's an elite choice. The judges have somehow reached the British state has somehow reached a collective decision that Tommy Robinson is of interest to them, and keeping Tommy Robinson in jail is of interest to them. And that's what I mean. Again, when you have rule by judges, that is necessarily a transfer of power from the masses to the elites. Similar in Australia, Andrew Vaccaro writes, Mark, talking about corrupted injustice systems, here in Melbourne, we've recently had the case of Australia's senior-most Catholic cleric, Cardinal Pell, having not only been convicted of sexual abuse with an unlikely story based solely on one person's evidence, but also having his appeal unjustly rejected. Pell has been a figure of much scorn from the left here in Australia for decades, as he has been a solid conservative on social issues. The media has been stewing in bile for him for all this time, so there was little chance of a fair jury. At his appeal, 2 judges dropped his appeal with very little reason. The dissenting judge gave more reason to allow the appeal than the 2 judges that dropped it. Victoria's judicial system has been flooded with leftist judges over the past decade, which has seen much lenient sentencing and an increase in crime as a result. Hopefully, Pell's appeal will be confirmed in the High Court, which is Australia's highest court, until they restore appeals to the Privy Council in London. Anyway, that set off a little ding-dong between our Australian listeners, and they went back and forth on this. And Kate Smythe asked me if I'd say a word about it. So I would like to say a word about it. And I don't believe the standard of proof in a criminal case. Believe me, I get sued a lot, so I've learned a thing or two along the way. I know that in the civil courts, a preponderance of the evidence is the legal burden you have to meet, and that in a criminal trial, it's you have to present evidence that is beyond reasonable doubt. There's no question in my mind that Cardinal Pell, who was accused of sexual assault, actually in the cathedral after Mass, there is no doubt in my mind that the case was not one beyond reasonable doubt, and that it is a miscarriage of justice. And I want to be clear what I'm saying here. I'm not talking about what he did or what his accuser did. I'm talking about the case as a point of law, that the prosecution did not meet its burden of proof and prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. Now, he was nevertheless convicted by a jury of his peers, supposedly. And this gets to what I was saying about judicial corruption. We are increasingly, in the age of identity politics, increasingly, these are who-whom questions, as Lenin put it. Australia is a very secular society. Perhaps even more so, I don't know what the exact figures are, but perhaps even more so than parts of Europe. It is not a high church-going society. And for most people, what they know is that the Catholic Church has been a sewer of sex abuse for decades. It's not something they have any direct knowledge of except what they read in the newspapers. And Cardinal Pell is an example of an institution that is tarnished in their eyes, while his accuser is an example of the victim. But on a point of law, that's not supposed to make any difference. And a judge is supposed to instruct a jury and remind a jury that they are supposed to find the accused guilty if the evidence convicts him beyond reasonable doubt. And I don't think they did that. Speaking of one of my cases, and I hope the High Court in Oz does at least examine that as a legal question. Speaking of my cases, Mark, I've not heard your comment on Michael Mann losing his libel suit against Dr. Tim Ball when the libel suit was dismissed for Mann's refusal to provide the underlying data behind his hockey stick. Can we expect this to have a positive impact on Mann's suit against you, says John Deeble. I don't know, my suit, this was a case in the British Columbia courts, and Michael Mann, he's the guy who came up with the climate change hockey stick, which was the most widely known scientific graph of the early years of the 21st century. Many governments, including the Canadian government, the New Zealand government, European governments, sent this lousy, rotten, stinking graph to every one of their citizens to tell them that the planet was broiling, nothing had happened for 1,000 years, and then, whoa, right in the 20th century, it shoots up like a rocket out the top right-hand corner of the graph. Which is the top right for you guys? This way. Top right-hand corner of the graph, and you're all going to fry. You're going to die. And it didn't happen, and the graph is rubbish. And Michael Mann sued Tim Ball in Canada for saying it was rubbish. Michael Mann, this case has been dismissed with prejudice, and Mann has been ordered to pay Tim Ball's costs. And I would urge you, Mann has, among other things, lied and misrepresented what actually happened in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. So if you go to Steyn online, we've actually posted the judicial decision at our website in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. You can tell it's all official because right at the end they're all calling the judge my lord and your lordship, as you do in court. And it ends with the judge saying that the defendant will have his costs not only for the application to dismiss the suit paid by Mann, but also the costs of the action, since the action is dismissed. So in other words, all his legal bills since Mann brought this action. Now, Mann has denied he's lost the suit, in effect. He's lost, the case has been thrown out, it's been dismissed with prejudice. And he's been saying, this stinker has been saying, oh, it's just some sort of procedural, you know, it's not a bit. And Tim Ball was getting old a bit, so the judge took pity on him and threw it out because he's getting up there in years and he's all a bit feeble. That is true. 3 of Dr. Ball's witnesses have died while this case has been chugging along, because Mann did what American litigants do, where the process is the punishment. You sue someone, then you sit on your butt and just let the case chug through the system while the taxi meter for legal bills is tick all the time. And it doesn't really matter who wins because you're ruined, your savings are exhausted, you've got a 7-figure sum in legal fees, and you're over. I know all this because Mann's doing this to me in the District of Columbia court system. This case was dismissed, and you can read the judge's thing. We're not trying to sell you anything here. You can read the BC court decision for yourself. This case was dismissed because of Michael Mann's failure to prosecute. The judge lays out a 3-year period in which Mann sat on his flabby butt and didn't do a single thing to advance this case to trial. And the judge rightly points out that's clearly prejudicial to the defendant and threw the case out. Now, Dr. Mann is actually doing the same thing in district. We'd like to depose him. We'd like to ask him about his hockey stick and his research and all the rest of it. I would. I may do that myself. And he said, oh, no, I can't be deposed in the next 6 months because I'm going to be down in Australia on some sabbatical. Well, you know, I don't see why we can't get some big shot silk in Victoria or Queensland or wherever he happens to be to depose him down under. And if Mann objects, as these tedious proceduralist twerps do in America, to being deposed by an Australian barrister, I'm happy to fly down there and do it myself. But the point is, his case was thrown out because a plaintiff is obliged to prosecute his case, and Mann did bugger all. And eventually, the Supreme Court of British Columbia realized that he was doing bugger all and threw it out. Roger McConkie, Mann's lawyer up there, he's a very savvy guy. I know this because he represented Maclean's magazine when the Canadian Islamic Congress attempted to criminalize my writing up there. We had Julian Porter, QC, my dear comrade in these battles for so many years, and Roger McConkie as Maclean's local counsel. And he's a clever guy. I don't believe he's a clever guy, and he's a functioning lawyer. And I don't believe he sat on his hands for 3 years doing nothing. I believe he did that because his client, Michael Mann, wasn't doing anything. And poor old Roger McConkie was obliged to go along with it. But you can read it for yourself. He's thrown out. He's a loser. Michael E. Mann, comma, loser. Timball won, Michael Mann lost. And we're going to see whether we can make that a twofer when the world's most sclerotic dump of a jurisdiction, the District of Columbia, eventually brings this thing to trial. Beth says, the cruise was absolutely amazing. This is a reference to the Mark Steyn cruise, which we loved. Thank you and your incredible staff for an awesome, memorable experience. We just checked in. We set sail from Vancouver to Alaska, came back to Alaska and had a grand old time. Let me have a look. Well, we got another comment on the... I thought we had another... Oh, yeah, here we are. Peter Duncan says, Mr. Steyn, I cannot thank you enough for all your hard work on this last cruise to Alaska. Your grand finale skit was one of the top 3 funniest things I've ever seen. And it was an extreme pleasure to be there for it. I'd love to know what the other 2 funniest things you've ever seen were. That was me and the great Michelle Bachmann, formerly of Congress from Minnesota. And Michelle and I reenacted the Lisa Page, Peter Strzok Russia investigation emails from Phelim McAleer's new play on the subject. And I tell you something, you don't want to act with children or animals, as W.C. Fields used to advise. You really don't want to act with Michelle Bachmann because basically she was the funniest thing ever in that skit, and I was doing little more than playing straight man. And Peter says, have you considered maybe selling that bit in DVD format or something like that? You're thinking too small, Peter. We're going to take it to Broadway. We're going to be at the Winter Garden. I don't know what's there at the moment. Hamilton, Phantom of the Opera, Les Miserables. We're going to kick them all out, and we're going to be doing that live on Broadway and then taking it on tour. Thank you very much for that, Peter Duncan from Shoreline in Washington. We got another cruise coming up next year, and we always have some fun stuff on that. If Joe Biden is still in the race by then, I may even reprise my special song for Joe Biden, and you can't say fairer than that. That's it for this edition of Mark's Mailbox. Thank you for all your questions. We will do it again on the radio, in audio, and next time on video right here.